This week on Government Matters.
Well, the primary objective of the PDCO is to find such a thing as many years in advance as we can so that we've got plenty of time to do something about it.
It's been dubbed the Armageddon Office, NASA's plan of attack to detect and track asteroids, comets, and other near-Earth objects.
We don't know what's being done with that data and what the consequences have been for the U.S. intelligence community.
A new analysis from Homeland Security and the FBI sheds new light on the OPM data breach. We break down the known, the unknown, and the need to know.
The shrinking number of millennials, there's one major cause of it, and that's simply that government has not been hiring millennials over the last 5 years.
Conventional wisdom about millennials in the federal workforce can be misleading. Government Matters starts right now.
From ABC 7 and News Channel 8, this is Government Matters.
To our viewers around the world on the American Forces Network and here in the nation's capital, thanks for joining us. Government is the engine that runs this city. That's why Government Matters. Every week we'll bring you the top headlines in tech, security, and management. I'm your host, Morris Jones. The relationship between the U.S. and Iran is at a very sensitive stage. Nuclear negotiations, international sanctions, and the future of Syria's civil war hang in the balance. 10 U.S. Navy sailors put all of those efforts at risk. Defense Secretary Ash Carter says a navigational mistake landed them in Iranian waters. The sailors were briefly detained and then released. Was it a diplomatic victory or an embarrassing contradiction? Barbara Starr takes a look.
An apology from a U.S. Navy sailor.
It was a mistake. That was our fault, and we apologize for our mistake.
It is not clear from the video that the sailor was speaking voluntarily. The U.S. government has not yet said under what circumstance the statement was made or if it was made under duress. But no formal apology from Secretary of State John Kerry during his multiple phone calls with Iran's foreign minister, Kerry offering a diplomatic view of Iran's release of the 10 sailors.
I also want to thank the Iranian authorities for their cooperation and quick response. These are always situations which, as everybody here knows, have an ability, if not properly guided, to get out of control.
Iran's foreign minister tweeting in part, happy to see dialogue and respect, not threats and impetuousness. If the U.S. Navy investigation shows the boats did drift into Iranian waters, the Obama administration knows it has little to complain about.
From a military perspective, what the Iranians did was completely appropriate. Had the situation been reversed, we would have done exactly the same thing.
But there are these provocative images of U.S. Navy sailors on their knees surrendering to a boarding party of armed Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps troops, hardliners in the region, broadcast on Iranian television for the whole world to see. The U.S. sailors seen stripped of their weapons, clearly uncertain what will happen next. After spending the night ashore, at 12:13 local time, Iranian forces released the American sailors from Farsi Island. They departed on the same 2 boats they'd been captured on and headed to the USS Anzio, a naval missile cruiser positioned in international waters in the Persian Gulf. From the Anzio, the sailors were transferred to the USS Truman aircraft carrier and then flown to shore. The pressure now on the U.S. Navy to explain how all of this could have happened.
The fault here is not that the Iranians took Americans into custody. The fault here is that the U.S. Navy somehow got 2 small, lightly defended, lightly manned, only 10 Navy sailors on board these 2 boats together. How did these 2 boats wind up inside Iranian territorial waters? This is a question the U.S. Navy has to answer.
Barbara Starr reporting. In 2013, the U.S. State Department agreed to a proposal making some cyber technology subject to multinational export controls called the Wassenaar Arrangement. Now, some of the nation's top cyber experts say that move backfired. Diane Cho explains.
Some of the nation's top cyber experts met on the Hill this week to express universal concern about the Wassenaar Arrangement. That pact governs military arms exports for dozens of countries. In 2013, it was amended to include intrusion and surveillance software and technology.
These changes were motivated by a desire to prevent authoritative regimes from repressing their people.
Congressman John Ratcliffe says the intent was noble, but it backfired.
This is not an export control on a few specific tools. It is a stringent new regulation on the entire cybersecurity industry and our customers that would harm the economic and national security of the United States. Ultimately, it would leave every American less protected and vulnerable to cyber criminals and cyber terrorists.
The U.S. is one of 41 countries that are part of the Wassenaar Arrangement. Critics argue under the proposed rule, the definition of intrusion software is too broad.
An extensive range of security technologies will now be subject to broad and burdensome licensing requirements in the U.S. If left unchanged, the proposed definition will have a chilling effect on the development of products and services and on the discovery of existing vulnerabilities. The simple fact is that the rule will do little to stop the spread of malicious intrusion and surveillance tools or curtail illicit hacking and intrusions in any way. In fact, the current rule would do just the opposite. It would handcuff security vendors and multinational companies from using all the tools available to them while imposing no restrictions on cybercriminals.
The State Department's Ann Ganser says initially private sector concerns came as a surprise.
The control was intended to capture purpose-built suites of operator-controlled software that are designed to extract data from a system, modify a system or its data, or modify the system to execute a malicious operator's instructions without the system's owner's knowledge. That was what we intended to control, and that is what we thought we controlled.
Renegotiating the Wassenaar Arrangement won't be easy. All 41 member nation states need to reach a consensus, and most of them need to turn back time. The State Department says 31 have already implemented this control.
For a number of them, presumably their starting point is going to be, well, wait a minute, we've been implementing this control for a year plus. We haven't had any problems. Why are you guys having problems? And so, we'll have to have that kind of discussion going back and forth. But at the end of the day, it would require us to be able to convince the other countries to go along with some sort of modification.
For Government Matters, I'm Diane Cho.
In Tech Matters, the Planetary Defense Coordination Office. This month, NASA formally established the PDCO. It supervises all agency-funded projects that find and characterize asteroids and comets that pass near Earth's orbit around the Sun. It's been dubbed the Armageddon Office. Joining me with more is Lindley Johnson, Planetary Defense Officer at NASA. What a cool title, Lindley. I hope NASA orders you some new business cards. Let's start with the technology. How does NASA detect and track near-Earth objects?
Well, we use largely ground-based telescopes that are surveying the sky every night of the month that the sky is clear and we can see these objects, except for during a full moon. These objects are too dim to be seen when the moon is full in the sky.
Now, this field really began to mature in 1998 when NASA started compiling surveys of near-Earth objects. Our viewers might be surprised to learn you detect about 1,500 of them each year. Give us a cross-section of those objects, Lindley. What are they, how big are they, and what kind of risk do they pose?
Well, that number of 1,500 objects, that varies from objects that might be as big as a mile across, although we're not finding very many of those these days since we've found a larger part of that population, all the way to objects as small as only a meter in size. As a matter of fact, in the last couple of days, we've found a couple of very small objects of only 1 or 2 meters in size that have passed within about 20,000 miles of the Earth.
It's amazing. It's almost like you're finding grains of sand in the ocean. Now, the Planetary Defense Coordination Office isn't an entirely new venture at NASA. The concept's been under consideration since 2010, so why now?
Well, with the increased visibility in this issue, events like Chelyabinsk in 2013, where a 20-meter-sized asteroid came in over the Russian city of Chelyabinsk, blew out a few windows, injured a few people. That has gotten the increased attention, and our office has gotten increased funding over the last few years. We went from about $10 million to $20 million in 2012 to $40 million, and now in 2016, the $50 million program here at NASA. So it warrants the additional attention and planning that is necessary in this endeavor.
President Obama wants to send a human mission to an asteroid. Congress has approved the funds for that. What's the timeline here?
Well, the first steps in that are what we call the asteroid redirect mission. This will be testing technology that is important to our journey to Mars, things like solar electric propulsion and movement of large masses through interplanetary space. Asteroid redirect mission will go to a near-Earth asteroid, collect a boulder off the surface, do a gravity tractor demonstration to divert that asteroid off of its trajectory a little bit, and then bring that boulder back into lunar orbit where the astronauts will go up and take samples.
Now, Lindley, your office will coordinate with FEMA, the Defense Department, and other agencies and international counterparts. What happens when you find a massive asteroid or comet headed straight for Earth?
Well, the primary objective of the PDCO is to find such a thing as many years in advance as we can so that we've got plenty of time to do something about it. But if an object is detected, the Minor Planet Center, which we work with, international database of all comets and asteroids in the solar system, will be one of the first to know. The observations come in there from the world, and they do the initial orbit determination. They will alert myself and others if there is a credible threat. We compare our results with our counterparts in like the European Space Agency. And then if there is a credible possibility of an impact, we channel that information through the administrator, NASA administrator, to the White House.
What do you think about the term Armageddon Office? It certainly gets our attention.
Well, it does get attention. The public relates to that, having seen a movie a few years ago that dealt with this subject. But our whole purpose is to prevent something like such a disaster as Armageddon, and that's why we're here.
Real quick before you go, has recent technology helped you do your job better? For example, we've got supercomputers now, things that we didn't have 10, 20 years ago.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the whole digitization of imaging process, that's the whole thing that makes this possible, and why we can take these wide area surveys and quickly find any moving objects in there and get those observations correlated and develop the orbit. So yes, technology plays a very important part, and we are taking advantage of new processing technology every day in this business.
Yeah, it might be hard to do this with Kodachrome.
That's for sure, yes.
Lindley Johnson, Planetary Defense Officer at NASA. Thanks and good luck, Lindley.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'll turn from tech to security straight ahead on Government Matters. The story of the OPM breach is like an onion. We're peeling back one layer at a time. The latest from FCW next. In security matters, the prescription for porous networks at the Office of Personnel Management. Last June, OPM revealed a massive data breach that compromised the personnel records of more than 21 million federal workers. The cyber incident resulted in a sweeping overhaul of the agency's IT infrastructure. Also cost Director Catherine Archuleta her job. Now there's a new analysis compiled by Homeland Security and the FBI that sheds new light on the breach. Joining me with the latest is Adam Mazmanian, Executive Editor for FCW. Hello. Adam, let's set the stage here. One of your reporters, Sean Lingus, got his hands on an unclassified memo. Tell us about it.
Well, it was an after-action report prepared by DHS and the FBI that basically took a look at two breaches that happened in the recent past, and we determined that one of them was, in fact, the OPM breach that was first reported in April of 2015. Now, these kinds of after-action reports are useful for contractors, for federal IT workers, to look at things they could be doing better in order to prevent those kinds of large-scale breaches.
All right, so what exactly did DHS and the FBI discover?
Well, what they found, and one of the biggest deals in the report, is that there was they identified kind of a lax culture when it comes to information security. There weren't software wasn't patched according to schedule. Dual-factor authentication wasn't used the way it should be, and people didn't have segmented access to the networks. This was a problem especially for people who were teleworking, logging in perhaps from their homes. They had access to a whole range of information that perhaps they should not have given their circumstances.
Art, the agency is trying to right its cyber hygiene. Here's an excerpt from FCW's report. Organization 1 is in the process of boosting identity management via two-factor authentication from IT security firm Exedium. OPM has also enlisted Booz Allen Hamilton and Campbell, California-based Force Scout Technologies for cyber defense tools under CDM. Put all of this into context for us, Adam.
Well, the government is in the middle of a very large push towards implementing two-factor authentication across all agencies. Two-factor authentication just means using an additional, usually a physical credential to complement your username and password. That way, if somebody does obtain your username and password, they still can't log into the network and get information without the card.
So how does this relate to FISMA?
Well, FISMA is basically the set of rules that the government uses to govern information security by agencies. And in the past, it has been kind of a laundry list. You check the box if you're doing all of the things they say you need to be doing. It was modified recently, and in its most recent form, it really tries to focus on outcomes. So having 100% use of dual-factor authentication, 95% patching up to date, and those kinds of things.
Adam, you've been following this story for months now. Before you go, I'm curious, what's still unknown about the OPM data breach?
I guess the biggest unknown for me is what's happened to the data. It was widely assumed that China or some aspect of the Chinese government or military was responsible for the hack. But the data hasn't shown up, on the black market as far as it has been reported so far. So it remains to be seen what the data will be used for.
Interesting. It could be years before we find out. Adam Mazmanian, Executive Editor of FCW. Thanks again, Adam.
Thank you, Morris.
We'll turn from security to management straight ahead on Government Matters. Do millennials in the federal workforce get a bad rap? Our Mythbuster from Deloitte joins me next. In Management Matters, a generational challenge for government. Only 1 in 4 federal workers can be called millennials, and that number is shrinking. The private sector boasts 1 in 3. A new report on this vital section of the workforce suggests conventional wisdom can be misleading. It could shed some light on the path forward. For more, I'm joined by William Eggers. He's Public Sector Research Director at Deloitte Services. Bill, let's start with some psychology. You've discovered that how young workers actually behave differs from how they tell pollsters they behave. Explain that.
Well, it's different from both how they tell pollsters how they behave, but even more so about it's different from all the anecdotes that we keep on hearing about millennials. Essentially, the narrative is that millennials don't want to work in government, they jump to the private sector right away, that they don't stay in a job very long, they're not passionate about their work, but the data doesn't support any of that. Actually, most of the conventional wisdom about millennials in government is actually wrong when you look at the data.
Now, your report finds the following statements are either false or probably false. Millennials have higher turnover rates than prior generations. Millennials are less passionate about their jobs in government. Millennials don't stick around. They'll decamp to the private sector in a heartbeat. Well, the jury's still out on how hard it is for the government to recruit millennials. Is this where federal agencies should focus their attention?
It's absolutely one area that should focus their attention because, in fact, the federal government has not been hiring millennials to the degree it needs to over the last 5 years. We have 45,000 less millennials in the federal government today than we had just 5 years ago. And the reason for that is not that millennials are quitting government work all the time. It's that the separation rate of millennials is higher than the hiring rate, which is flat or declining. So basically, government's not hiring workers fast enough and also needs to do a much better job of creative hiring practice and getting that time to hire way reduced, because otherwise, millennials will choose a job in the private sector somewhere else if they can get that job offer 9 months earlier than they can get it from government.
Could it be the way USAjobs.com and computers look for the people to hire? Veteran preferences, for example. A lot of millennials aren't in the military, they're not veterans, but when you go to some of these job websites, you get extra points for being in the military, for being a long-term government employee. How does that work?
I think the big lesson from that is that the creative government agencies don't rely just on USA Jobs and government websites to find employees. Let's look at some examples of this. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau was looking for technologists when they got started. And they said, you know, we need to look beyond USA Jobs because the best technologists, developers, are not going there necessarily. And you know what they did? They actually went to a lot of the developer recruiting websites and they posted it there. But then they also they knew a lot of developers like to hide around and hunt around in the source code of websites. So they actually hid and posted different job openings in the source code. It was a really, really creative and interesting way of doing this. One other example, 18F, the White House, the U.S. government's digital shop, went from 0 to about over 100 technologists within a year. How did they do that? They hacked the hiring process and they reduced it from 6 to 9 months to 6 to 9 weeks.
Smart. You've got to be creative. We've covered this topic before on Government Matters, Bill. Experts blame stagnant wages, congressional attacks, or bloated bureaucracy for the shrinking number of millennials in government. We've talked about some of the issues. What did the data tell you?
Again, the data tells us the shrinking number of millennials is not because of greater turnover rates, or they're not passionate about government service, or they're just jumping from job to job. The shrinking number of millennials, there's one major cause of it, and that's simply that government has not been hiring millennials over the last 5 years. And so we need to ramp up the hiring of millennials, and similarly, we also need to change some of the hiring processes to making it easier. Lastly, I would say that when you go to universities, when you go to graduate schools, and when you're looking for the best and the brightest, government agencies need to be there, competing against the consulting firms, the system integrators, and the private sector. But oftentimes, you don't see the government agencies there, and then you wonder why millennials aren't going into government service.
Exactly right. You've got some good points. Bill Eggers, Public Sector Research Director at Deloitte. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks so much.
And we'll turn from management to final matters straight ahead. FirstNet just issued its request for proposals for a nationwide public safety broadband network. There's a lot at stake, including 20 megahertz of spectrum and billions of dollars. Next week, I'll sit down with FirstNet President T.J. Kennedy. Join us then. And that's the latest from Washington. Thanks for being with us. I'm Morris Jones. We know your week is filled with other matters. Save this half hour for us.